Hello, my name is Russell Swanson, and this is a brief recap of my lecture on the social contract theory of morality. In that last lecture, I talked about how social contract theory in the modern age, particularly emerging in the 17th century, is kind of like Glaucon 2.0, if you recall from my earlier lecture on Platonic philosophy in the Republic. One of the characters there, Glaucon, took a position on morality or on justice, as it was described in Republic, that described it as a kind of a compromise that we make with each other out of an awareness of our vulnerability. That idea gets reborn, as many aspects of Greek philosophy do in the modern age, and becomes the social contract theory. And Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher who studied at Oxford, becomes the first important writer in ethical philosophy in the West, because he's the first to really wrestle with, as we described in an earlier lecture, what I've called the modern crisis in ethics. And that is that he saw that there would be a problem in trying to justify our moral claims to one another, given the metaphysics that seem to be emerging out of the scientific worldview. If we looked at the world and reality through the lens of science, especially early Enlightenment science, we get this picture of reality as purely physical, purely material, and running like a large machine, running by natural laws, but those laws seem physical, chemical, and biological, and in no way moral in terms of what we can observe. And so if that's our picture of reality, we've got this problem in terms of explaining what we're talking about with regard to morality with one another. And we're certainly going to have a problem in the modern age with trying to justify our moral claims about what kind of conduct we think we should allow and what kind of conduct we think we should condemn in modern societies. And so Hobbes saw this tension and wrote on it in his work Leviathan, published in 1651. And basically, he began a strategy that becomes very popular in the 17th and 18th century, which is to talk about how a social contract emerges out of the conditions of the state of nature, something like the more natural conditions of Homo sapiens prior to complex civilizations. And so I won't go through in this review all the details there, but just the general moves. Hobbes argues that the state of nature is a difficult place. It's a war of most against most. He claims of every man against every man, and that the dominant experience in the state of nature is one of insecurity or fear or vulnerability. And motivated by this fear, this biological experience of fear, we use our human capacity to reason or think and realize that there is a way out of this. And the way out of this is sort of safety in numbers. The trouble is we also know ourselves, and we've seen enough of other human beings in the state of nature to realize that we are not trustworthy. And so Hobbes comes up with this interesting idea that the social contract occurs, but all that does is makes an agreement between, let's say, human groups to try to temporarily suspend what he called their natural right, which was basically their tendency to do whatever it takes to survive, to suspend that briefly long enough to try to get an experiment off the ground. And that experiment is the creation of a Leviathan, and hence the name of the book. It's a biblical reference to a sea monster, right? We need to create a monster of our own. Why? Because that's the only thing that can reliably keep humans in check. And so we create this monster, which basically forms strong central government, civil authorities. And we give these civil authorities literally kind of a physical and military advantage over ourselves. Why? Because we see that it will be in our long-term self-interest if we can pull this off. Of course, there's a lot of ways that this could go wrong, but occasionally this could go right. And when it does, the Leviathan, this new group that's in charge of just ensuring how multiple different human groups can cooperate in a larger organized structure, and generating the laws and rules and enforcing those with the sword, as Hobbes would say, that will be the way that we begin to live in larger cooperative societies. And the rules that make that possible will become the norms of public morality. In the state of nature, all that had ever existed in terms of evaluation was what we could call a simple subjectivism, a kind of an individual level relativism. What's good to me is what I like. What's good to you is what you like. If we disagree, we're both right. And the only thing left is to sort of fight it out and see who survives. In the case of the development of a Leviathan, where we get the emergence of strong central civil authority, we see the emergence of what we might think of as a public good or a public morality for the first time. It is a social construction, and it is something which we internalize over the generations once we live within that experiment. And there's Hobbes' version of the social contract theory from the 17th century. But we also talked about how this theory is one of the leading theories to this day in the 21st century, and how it is updated over time by other theorists. And I pulled from the work of James Rachels, the deceased American philosopher, who argued that contemporary social contract theory is less top-down, less authoritarian sounding, a little bit more democratic sounding than the way Hobbes put it. Hobbes basically said morality is going to come from the dictates of the Leviathan that's got this kind of absolute authority once we create it. That's very top down. He thought that was required in order to stamp order onto chaos. He wasn't so afraid of tyranny because he thought tyranny was preferable to chaos. However, once you have a modicum of security and safety, most human beings want more than just to be safe. They also want to be free. They want to have a level of privacy. They want to be treated with some level of equality, and they want opportunities to flourish. And simple focus on security doesn't get us there. So more contemporary expressions of social contract theory, especially as James Rachels characterizes them, would sound something like this. Morality consists of those rules which rational people would accept for their mutual benefit if others were to accept them as well. And this generates a kind of at least an opportunity to dialogue in an objective way about what should be the moral judgments we pass on one another in contemporary pluralistic societies that have their notion of reality informed very strongly by science. Even within societies where we allow religious freedom, where people can believe or not to believe, we're still going to need a way to talk about how we're going to live together. And the public good, the public morality is going to help us to glue such pluralistic societies together. And given this modern metaphysics, this modern way of looking at the world given to us by science, social contract theory tries to give us a foundation for our discourse by claiming that we should pass those judgments on one another based only on the rules that rational people would accept for their mutual benefit. And I've kind of implied here what I did next in my lecture, which was to say that there's a lot of advantages to this theory. It explains a lot of our intuitions about morality. It's practical, it's useful. It provides us, I think, most importantly, with this capacity for difficult but objective and rational and logical debate about morality within pluralistic societies. And it takes the mystery out of morality, just to sort of refer to a couple of the most important advantages of the social contract theory. However, we finished the lecture by pointing out that social contract theory, as we'll see, like most of the modern theories, of course, does have some limitations. It's been criticized for sort of being a historical fiction. We dealt with that in the lecture. I think that social contractarians have a way to respond to that criticism that social contract theory is a great story, but it doesn't exist, and so it can't really explain something that does exist, like morality. I think we can deal with that. I talked about that at length in the lecture. However, I will draw your attention to what I think is the single most problematic aspect of social contract theory to this day, for which I've never heard a very good response, which is that this is a conception of morality which focuses on rational beings. That's built right into this characterization that I've given you from James Rachel's, that morality consists of the rules that rational beings would accept for their mutual benefit. And this fails to deal with a number of intuitions we have about how it's wrong to treat non-rational beings with a total lack of regard, and to use, as I did in the lecture, kind of an exaggerated but unfortunately real kind of example here. If we find a person torturing sentient creatures, whether they are severely mentally handicapped human beings, or whether they're dogs, or even whether they're possums or armadillos, in some sense, it doesn't matter, right? Like, all of that is obviously morally abominable, right? It would be horrible for a person to just, and unfortunately this happens, for people to just without any justification cause harm to a creature that can feel harm. But if that creature is not rational enough to enter into the social contract with us, it's just not clear what a social contractarian could say in order to justify a moral condemnation. And so in my lecture, I explored what I thought were a couple of band-aid solutions, a couple of indirect responses to that criticism. But to my mind, there's not a good response, and this just represents a limitation to the social contract theory. And that completes my brief review of my lecture on the social contract theory of morality.